Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join His mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.
Welcome back to Missions Pulse, where we encourage you to know God's heart and join His mission. I'm really excited about this conversation because, first of all, it's time sensitive. We're going to be talking about the coronavirus that's taken place in China. We're talking about narratives we talk about China, when in fact there are much more nuanced answers and bigger picture things that God is doing. Joining me today is founder/catalyst of ChinaSource.org, Brent Fulton. And hey, Brent, what an honor it is to see you. Welcome to the show.
David, great to be with you.
Well, we did this a while back. I think we did a Facebook Live video or something like that a few years ago. Gosh, time flies. But I think this will be a little bit more specific and probably more poignant conversation about what's taking place right now in global missions.
Yeah.
Now, you recently stepped down as president of ChinaSource. This is a ministry and an organization that you founded a number of years ago. Why don't you catch people up about your story and tell us who you are?
Sure. Well, I first got involved in China ministry back in the 80s, working in Hong Kong for a couple of years with an organization that was working closely with the rural house church primarily, and came back to the States with that same organization. And during that time, I actually ended up being based at the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena, California, and had the privilege of seeing many people coming in and out on their way to China or on their way back from China, hearing their stories, and just really sensed that there was more that could be done if we were to, during this critical time in history, take the time to really listen to each other, share what we were learning, and find ways of maybe working together, because there were so many organizations that were getting involved in China during that time. So that vision was not just my own, but there was others in the mission community that saw the need for something similar. And that ultimately led us to Wheaton College, where my wife Jasmine and I worked for a while. And it was there that ChinaSource was born as a platform for connecting the various ministries that work in China, and as a platform for sharing information. And that was over 20 years ago. ChinaSource has become very much that platform.
I would consider ChinaSource much of a hub, particularly when you're talking about China, those who are serving either cross-culturally from their countries in China or looking at China to see different trends that are taking place. I think something we're going to be talking about today is these narratives, because we have certain images and imagery that comes up in our mind when you say that single 5-letter word China. It could be very polarized depending on what vantage point you're looking at politically. You'll see it from a particular viewpoint. You talk about Christians in China, you'll probably think about persecution. Maybe people have seen that. You've seen it, Brent, too, right? The video where people are receiving Bibles for the very first time in China, and there's this eruption of joy and people kissing the Bibles. They've never had them in their lives. And I think we have these different narratives we tell. What are you seeing right now that perhaps needs to change in our narrative of what is taking place in China today?
Well, I think over the years that I've been involved in China, there have been kind of 4 dominant narratives that stand out. The first, obviously, is the persecution narrative, the narrative of the persecuted church. But then out of that flows the needy China narrative, which you kind of just alluded to now. This church is in survival mode. It needs our help. There's a lot of things we can do for them. But then you have the Christian China narrative, which says that if there was just a critical mass of believers in China, they would actually exert cultural and political influence on the nation and change the fabric of the nation. So we need more Christians, and we need more Christians in positions of influence in China. And then more recently, you've had the missionary church narrative, which sees China as positioned to field perhaps the largest mission force in the history of the church. And there's a lot of excitement around that. And I know you personally are quite involved in that and have been for years as well. So all of these 4 narratives, they certainly represent a slice of what God's doing in the church in China. They are based in some reality. but none of them tells the whole picture. And I think the danger is that when we latch onto one of those narratives, we end up losing the much bigger picture of what God is doing. And we could potentially end up limiting it ourselves just by not being open to seeing other things that are actually happening.
I think that's why I'm excited to talk to you today, because I want to kind of unfold some of those narratives. When I first arrived in China, well, it was 1995. I think I was 16 years old when I first landed in China, smuggling Bibles from Hong Kong into China. And I could have written a book about China back in that time. And then I moved to China, and a couple, months in, I thought, well, these nuances are starting to confuse me a little bit. I think I could write a blog post about China. About 23 years in, I can tweet about China. I mean, there's certain things you cannot pigeonhole and say China is this and China is that. And on that note, I mean, we're struggling with this and seeing this incredible shutdown in China because of the coronavirus, specifically in Wuhan. What is that narrative? Again, is this retelling another aspect or facet of a narrative of China that people are misunderstanding? Or can you explain what's taking place in China via the coronavirus?
I once heard a journalist who said there's basically three stories about China. There's the big China, the bad China, and the strange China. And I think with the coronavirus, you're seeing all three.
Yeah.
Big. It's a pandemic. I'm not sure officially if WHO is using that word yet right now, but it looks to be that. It's huge. It's affected tens of thousands of people across the country. China's response to it is big. What other country in the world quarantines multiple cities, up to 35 million people, and simply says nobody's leaving?
Yeah, and when you I'm sorry to pause you right there too, but I was going to say, when you say quarantines, I mean, I don't think we understand what's actually taking place. We receive messages every day from our local missionaries in China. There are people stationed outside their homes at the edge of the village. They cannot move, and cupboards are bare. People don't have any access to food right now. I mean, this is, of those affected via the virus, we're talking one thing. Another thing is we're kind of being hurled back in time and not being able to obtain basic necessities.
Right. And that's where the bad China narrative comes in. China's government has come in for a lot of criticism about how they're handling the coronavirus. For that very reason, people not being able to get food, basic services. Many have said that quarantining people in a particular city after the virus has already left the city is kind of too little, too late. Actually, too much, too late. And so, yes, China's taking draconian measures in dealing with this, the way they take draconian measures in dealing with a lot of things.
I was going to say, this is not the new narrative, right, of one that you paint perhaps on a governmental level. And I know you at ChinaSource, and I think you personally are not out to attack the government of China. I don't think that's the goal and heart whatsoever at ChinaSource, ChinaSource.org. But there are times you need to address the reality of what some might consider the regime of China, and that is part of the storyline.
It's very much part of the storyline. Their way of dealing with problems is just massive control and massive resources. And because China's so big and has so many resources, they can do it. It doesn't mean that it's going to be effective, but that's how they choose to deal with things. And there is a fallout when they do that.
Well, you mentioned the third narrative as well as the strange one.
The strange China, right? And that's well, you could have a field day with that one. And journalists, one of the latest stories out of Hong Kong is the toilet paper shortage. Why is there a toilet paper shortage in Hong Kong? We're not quite sure, but the shelves are bare in the supermarket. Evidently, people are hoarding toilet paper in Hong Kong.
That would fall under the bizarre, strange category. I mean, I think you've had a long experience both in and outside of China and Hong Kong. I've had many a times where I could have wished there was a little bit more toilet paper on the shelf or in my pocket when I wandering around Hong Kong at times, but alas, we digress. So you recently had a webinar or conversation come out on ChinaSource. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's where we actually looked at these four narratives in some detail, and did a couple things. One is we looked at what are the implications of our narratives, and I mentioned earlier some of those, and then looked at the narratives and the reality. And if you look back at the last 40 years, what's happened with the church and with the political situation in China, you can see how different narratives have kind of risen up to the top at different times in history because of what was going on. And so in the webcast, we looked at that. We looked through history and saw how the different narratives have developed. And then finally, we looked at, what would a new narrative look like? If none of these four narratives, which we tend to use a lot, really tell the whole story, well, how can we get beyond them? And arrive at a more accurate way of talking about the church in China in the area of Xi Jinping, which is very different than the area of Deng Xiaoping. We're in a new chapter here.
Absolutely.
And we'd like to talk about it.
Well, absolutely. And this, for those who don't know, I think it would be helpful to paint kind of an overarching picture of the history of China. Can't go back 5,000 years. They have a long history. Even if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, from the Boxer Rebellion or Boxer up to the Cultural Revolution, 1949. I'm sorry, the Communist Takeover, 1949, Cultural Revolution, 1966, 76. Tumultuous times. Then we came into a time when I think your China experience began. Mine came a little bit later. And we saw quite an open China. I mean, there was an open heaven for many of the years that I was working in ministry. It was difficult. I was interrogated a number of times. There was persecution, to be sure. However, we saw great discipleship taking place, multiplication of churches. Now, with President Xi Jinping, a new wave of persecution has come. What does that, I know you want to tell a new narrative, but this is a present reality. What is that really like on the ground for Chinese, for people serving in the church? I think people could point obviously to latter rain and Chengdu and the imprisonment of different Christian leadership. What does it look like to you?
I think that's a really good point. I've heard many people say, well, it's just like being back in the 80s again. Things were tough back then, and they were restrictive, and now we see ourselves in a very similar environment. It's not surprising that the persecuted church narrative is, again, the dominant narrative, particularly in the media as it looks at China, and for good reason. Like you said, there have been churches closed down, their prominent pastors have been taken in for questioning, some are in jail. This is a reality. I think what's important to remember, though, is the church is at a very different place than it was in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the church was marginalized. It was primarily rural. It was very under-resourced. It had no influence in society. And most of the people within the church were pretty isolated from the rest of the world. The church today is quite different. It's primarily urban. There are a lot of educated people who have been overseas, who've studied overseas. It's much more cosmopolitan in its outlook. The believers have much more influence in their society, in the business world, in the academy, some even in government and in media. And so I think the church's ability to respond to the atmosphere of persecution is much different than it was 40 years ago. And so that's what I'm looking at. What does the church need to do to respond to this new wave of social tightening that they're experiencing?
Well, yeah, I can see the narrative. Should we paint the continual let's go only back to the 80s. We could go back farther and talk about persecution, but this is more recent, the difficulty and struggle in the marginalized church. If you're going to think that this is Mao Zedong's 1960s to 70s China, you are thoroughly mistaken as far as looking at the Chinese church. Some would say the persecuted church, some would say the underground church, whereas now there's been a wave of an exodus of Western missionaries out of China. largely gone by now due to persecution and now coronavirus. But in one aspect, there are many positive sides to this. I think, for me, that would be one of the narratives I would retell. China does not need the crutch of the Western Church. Not to say the Western Church does not have a part to play in China, right? But for many years, we've had pastors and leaders and missionaries, and it kind of perpetuates maybe even the savior complex to say, we can do this and we will show the Chinese, how it's done. Whereas now I see the rise of a viable church that can reach even beyond into their own unreached people groups within the boundaries and borders of China. Is that what you're saying?
Definitely. I mean, in the 80s, the persecuted church and the needy church narratives went together. There was very much a sense, and it was a reality. The church needed Bibles, the church needed training, the church needed leaders. It needed everything. And the overseas Chinese church and the Western church responded in a big way and have responded for now decades. But as you said, the needs have changed. A lot of those very practical needs that were so prominent back in the 80s are no longer the acute needs of the church. And I think the needs are much more nuanced. In some ways, they're more abstract. They're not necessarily things that a bunch of Western missionaries are going to be able to provide for the church. And so, by God's grace, I think we've entered into a new era of partnership. At least that's what I hope that we would see out of this. And then, as you mentioned, with Western workers having to leave China, then the question is, well, how do we partner? We can't be on the ground with our brothers and sisters in China, yet we still are called to work together. What's that going to look like?
I was hoping you were going to give us the final answer with steps 1 to 5, and we could just finish it. I think that's the whole conversation of what you're saying here. We want to pigeonhole China or many other aspects of our life into certain boxes and categories so that we can understand and tackle it properly. And I think that reveals again that humanistic approach to say we can do this, or the savior complex of the missionary, not intentional, but says we can accomplish this. Now you're saying a much more nuanced answer, wherein only the Holy Spirit can drive this direction and we follow along and are not in the driver's seat, not in control. Is that what you're describing?
It's very much what I'm describing. The narratives, the dominant narratives that we've used to describe the church in China, in many ways say more things about us than they do about the church in China.
Wow.
They tell us about who we are. And like you said, one of the things we have a propensity to do is to say, we want to know the issues and we want to know the answers. And those narratives provide neat answers to what we see as the critical issues. Problem is, we don't always see the critical issues well. There are other issues out there that we don't see. And as I mentioned, the needs of the church in China are a lot more nuanced than they were before. We don't have all the answers. So are we willing, as foreign workers, as brothers and sisters to the believers in China, to say, we may not be seeing this really accurately, and we don't even know what the answers are. So we need to be in a listening mode. And we need to recognize that we don't have a nice, neat 3-year plan or 5-year plan of what we should be doing in China.
Or the one that we had, we kind of need to put it aside or perhaps even tear it up. I think we're talking in a little bit. Well, I think for you and I, we've experienced China very deeply over the years, and many others who are watching or listening. For those who don't, this could perhaps seem like a theoretical, maybe 50,000-foot view of China. Is there a way we could bring this down to the ground level and say, what you're describing the church as a whole? It could feel like a mass conglomerate of people who I don't even know their names, can't pronounce them because they all start with X's or something, So is there a way we can make this more personal? How can we tell me a story of an individual and what is taking place in their formerly rural, maybe now urban setting of a Chinese church?
Well, I think of some brothers outside Beijing who came out of a rural house church setting, large network of rural house churches. They followed the migrant flow from the countryside to the cities, along with 300 million other people. Yeah. and ended up planting churches on the outskirts of Beijing in these migrant communities. I think of their lives right now, they're pretty complicated. When they moved to those migrant communities, I think they might have been married, but they didn't have any kids. Now they've got teenage kids. And unlike their parents, who were willing to do just about anything to get to the city and survive, their kids are not willing to do that. They see what's going on in the city. They see the attractions of the big city. They want them. But of course, because of China's hukou, or household registration system, those kids don't have access to all those goodies in the cities. And so these migrant pastors from the countryside are now dealing with not only the issues of their church, but their own families. And I think we often overlook that family life in China is complicated, like it is anywhere. And for Christian leaders, particularly, that's a huge issue for them. How are they going to disciple those kids? Where are those kids going to go to school? How are those kids, when they're ready for university, how are they even going to get into university? They're migrants. I bet right now they're probably really struggling with the coronavirus. Probably some of their communities have been quarantined off. Travel is restricted. They may be having a hard time getting food right now. Yeah. And then the other thing I've noticed as I've watched them over the years is they're always having to move, because when they came to Beijing is a city of concentric circles. They have these roads that run around the city, and they go from the second ring to the third ring to the fourth ring, and so on out to the suburbs. And when they first came, I think they were kind of living around the fourth ring road. That's where they could find places to live, and that's where they could set up their little churches. Well, the developers came in and started building condos around the fourth ring road, so that didn't work. So then they had to, literally their places where they were worshiping and living were torn down. They had to move out to the fifth ring road. Then it was the sixth ring road. Wow. And so that's been part of their life for years. Just to say, for this particular slice of the church in China, life is complicated. Yeah. You can't really make big generalizations about them, and you need to really get to know them and understand how complicated their lives are.
Well, I think if people are gonna get to know China in a more reality, things based on reality, I always have to point back to ChinaSource.org, because in your assessments, I know there are a number of different contributors and authors and writers who are contributing to ChinaSource.org, but it's always seemed to me very fair and clear reality of what's taking place. There are many other websites that will blow up certain narratives. Yes, the needy, the persecuted. ChinaSource has always seemed to me a place where there is a great baseline of what's actually taking place. I would point people to ChinaSource.org to get to know the reality. When you describe these buildings being torn down, urban migration, migrants moving in, a hukou system that people have to go out to the hometowns of which they were born in to accomplish any kind of paperwork, travel documents, etc. People don't even realize that this is a reality. I remember, must have been, I was in the 2000s, somewhere between 2005 and 2010, I would be walking around driving my bicycle around Kunming, southwest China, and there were signs everywhere on old, what seemed to be abandoned or concrete or brick buildings that were now torn apart, nothing inside, no windows, with spray painted in big red letters, Chai, Chai, Chai. It was to be destroyed or destroy. And everywhere I looked around, I saw the word destroy or to be destroyed, all these buildings being torn down. My memories of a China I once knew are now buried between 1 meter of pavement and asphalt and other layers. And in their place have come, like you mentioned, condos and skyscrapers, and they're going up like crazy. How has this rapid development shifted the minds and the cultural values of an entire country? Do you see that happening as well?
Yeah, I think the technological and economic development has gotten way, way out beyond the people's ability to deal with it.
No, what do you mean by that?
You have a class of people who suddenly got pretty wealthy pretty quick, There's many stories in China about the people who had so much money they didn't know what to do with it, and it ruined them. You've got a generation of people who suddenly didn't have the previous cultural norms, social norms, to weigh them down, particularly those who moved from the countryside to the cities. Their parents weren't around to tell them what to do or what not to do. They had incredible freedom to pursue anything they wanted in relationships or otherwise, and really no value system to say this is what's good, or this is what's appropriate, or this is what's going to be good for you long term.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off right there, but when you don't have a necessarily a moral baseline or compass, good is a very theoretical idea. And I think that's what you're pointing at. A whole country is in a tumultuous period culturally because of rapid development. And this is the best China for the common man in the last 5,000 years. Let's be honest. I mean, the way that things have grown and developed. However, with that rapid development comes some major cultural struggles.
Mm-hmm. And I see that with the church, too. You look at the urban church that has really come into its own in the last decade or so. Economically, technologically, in terms of their education level, in terms of their status in society, they have done amazing things. They pushed the envelope in so many ways. But yet, their ability to relate to one another and their ability to lead the church, their ability to discern what's good and what's not good, what's right and wrong, those haven't kept up. And I think the rural church, one of its strong points for all the things that it didn't have was it had a strong sense of waiting upon the Lord, huge sense of importance of prayer and waiting on God, a legacy of a strong devotional life. I think the urban church just never got that. They got systems, they got theology, they got good teaching, they got the ability to do a lot, whether through the internet or through publishing or through starting new organizations or building urban churches. But that spiritual foundation wasn't there. And so again, I think the church ended up getting way ahead of itself in its ability to sustain some of the things that it has been doing.
We're talking a lot about China, and I don't want to come across that we are picking on China and tearing every aspect apart, because I think you can make some strong parallels of what you're saying. If I was to close my eyes or not have listened to the first beginning of this conversation, only the last 2 minutes, it sounds to me like you're describing many situations in the Western church. Is there parallels between what China has rapidly moved toward and the Western church, where we don't know the value of waiting on God and humility, and rather we have systems and structures? And, Hudson Taylor himself, I think in a 1903 address in New York, said we have too much focus on machinery and methods, and we have lost the value of reliance on the Holy Spirit. Is that some parallels that you could see within the Western church framework as well?
Yeah, here we are a century later, and I think you could say the same thing. The machinery is different, but I think the analysis is very accurate, unfortunately. It's not a Chinese issue, it's not a Western issue. We humans tend to grab onto things like technology, and we use them, but sometimes we use them uncritically, and we don't really reflect on what they're doing to us. We reflect on, how useful this thing is, whether it's your iPhone or the ability to do what we're doing, is to talk, halfway across the world on Skype. So it's all very useful, and we grab onto it and we say this can be used to extend the gospel. Maybe it can, but also there are other effects of grabbing onto this technology and using it. And I think it's a long time later that we finally begin to look at what it's really done to us. As we Westerners look at China and again, getting back to the narratives, kind of diagnosing, well, what's going on with the church in China and what do they need and what should we be doing? I think we need to be a lot more self-reflective about the way we tend to grab onto methods and strategies and technology and machinery, to use Hudson Taylor's words, and what those things do to us.
Yeah.
In the process.
It's funny as you say that. It doesn't seem like this would be the thing that I have experienced over the years. When I first moved to China, I had all the answers. I mean, I was 18 years old. Of course, I had all the answers. And, over the years, the one thing that I've learned in China, and you learn this in life, regardless of your geographical coordinate, but the longer I spent in China, the more I learned about myself. There's lots of nuances. There's partitions throughout. You can't describe every facet of government, and cultural milieu, and the landscape. But the biggest thing that I learned was about myself, my brokenness, my ability or inability to deal with stresses or issues that arise inevitably in a place like China. So you're pointing back to kind of assessing China and saying we need to be more reflective and learn what is taking place in our heart. I mean, what's the one thing that you think you would like to encourage people who are watching and listening, or ChinaSource has a goal to encourage people to look at China through the lens of what? What are you trying to accomplish, I guess is the question overarching at ChinaSource?
Well, I think back to the 1980s, there was a radio program on shortwave radio. It was called Seminary of the Air. And it was a lifeline for a lot of rural pastors who had no training. And so they would listen to this program every week, and that became literally their Seminary of the Air. And every episode of that program opened with the hymn sung in Chinese, "The Church is One Foundation. Jesus Christ the Lord." And I think that's where the narrative that we need to come back to. It's Christ who is forming his people, whether in America or whether in Asia. It's Christ who's forming his people, his church, his bride. And we need to be asking constantly, how is he forming his bride?
Yeah.
Maybe he's actually using persecution to do it. Maybe some of the things we see as setbacks or problems that need to be solved somehow are actually Christ's way of forming his church.
Well, these are things that you're alluding to. These are actual promises from Jesus. Persecution. If the world persecuted me, they will persecute you. We do not gravitate towards that promise from Jesus of persecution. And I think only those who have suffered and gone through difficulties will be able to see that real strong triumph. And there's no shortcuts. And I think that's what you're alluding to. I really pray that as people are, watching and listening, that they would kind of even pause and reflect in a Selah kind of manner David in the Psalms would often end with, and step back and take a look at not only China, because it might not be as poignant in many people's lives, but their own circumstances and situations. The suffering that God allows, the brokenness that he uses to create beauty. Recently, the Lord put thoughts of brokenness on my heart, wanting to write a book about that. And I've been thinking a lot about Kintsugi. You've heard of this Kintsugi, Japanese term for the repairing of broken pottery with that gold seams. There was, in the 15th century, a tradesman, and he had all this pottery that was broken in the palace, and the emperor wanted him to repair it, so he thought of new different methods. They started using gold, platinum, and silver along the seams to repiece these broken, valuable pottery back together. Well, it elevated the value of the pottery so much that these different men would take actual vessels whole and smash them intentionally so that they could seam them back together with gold, platinum, silver, and elevate the value. It seems to me all the brokenness that God either allows or that has taken place in our lives, or the church has undergone, the suffering, God is somehow able to take brokenness and create beauty, elevate the value of his people. And include us in his glory, even through that shattered and broken shards.
That's a beautiful image. Recently, my wife and I read a book by Michael Card. It's called A Sacred Sorrow, and it's a book about lament. And he says we've really lost the ability in our age to lament, and the ability to do what David and what Jeremiah and what Christ himself and so many others in scriptures understood. He makes this statement: there's no worship without wilderness. And oftentimes we don't want to go to the wilderness, but we don't realize that God's taking us there so we could have just a much greater appreciation for who he is and his love.
As you described that, immediately I'm reminded of a situation that took place. It was in Shandong, northeastern China, and it was about 2005. Met some leaders in the underground church there who came down for a training. They requested that my wife and I, go up and train young leaders how to play guitar and lead worship. And we would be there. We were locked in this compound, not allowed to go out for one solid week. And we would teach guitar and worship. We worshiped all day and all night. And before the classes begin that I was teaching in Chinese, we would be woken up, my wife and I, by the sound of wailing and crying. Well, it was the Chinese prayer time. You know what I'm talking about. Those deep, it seems to be when the church that I've, experienced along the way is very vocal in their tears, and you can see brokenness and that humility and just calling and crying out to God. This is what's marked the Chinese church for me. The wilderness is very much a part of the lives of the people that I've experienced along the way. A new church may not have experienced those deep struggles of the past, but there is some sort of intimacy that is found in pouring your spirit, your soul out before the presence of God, and he leads you on in a new direction and thus empowers you to see the gospel spread beyond what you had previously realized.
There's so much that we can learn from our brothers and sisters in China, and I would agree that's one thing that we really need to try to take on board in our own lives and ponder.
Well, as we kind of come to a close, and we've talked about coronavirus and the narratives that we tell about China, Brent, I wanted to ask you a couple things. Number one, I'm going to ask you in a moment where people could go to follow both you and ChinaSource, et cetera. I've already mentioned ChinaSource.org. But what is one kind of encouragement that you'd like to give to those who are watching and listening? Maybe they're not so involved in China, but they're going through their own struggles and difficulties, and they're trying to see the narrative of their own life unfold. As these chapters are being written, as the psalmist said, all the days ordained for me, written in your book before one of them came to be. What is the encouragement you'd like to give people who are watching and listening today?
Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. I think if we look at the history of the church in China, what stands out is God's sovereignty. So often we want to know the answers. We want to know what's going on, what's next. We want everything figured out. God doesn't allow us to do that. But if we are willing to simply say, he is God, and I'm content with that he is in control, that he's sovereign, then we can trust that his purposes are good and that his purposes will be fulfilled. You look back at the history of Christianity in China, again and again, God's best work has been done in the most difficult of circumstances.
That's right. Well, thank you for that encouragement. And I know we've already pointed to the website. How else can people follow you, find your books? I know you are a international bestseller by now, or?
Not quite.
Not quite, okay.
It's called China's Urban Christians, a light that cannot be hidden. It's about the urban church in China, and that's available on Amazon. And then I do blog on the ChinaSource.org website. And as you mentioned, there's a webcast there available as well.
Now, that webcast just came out by the time of this airing, so you should be able to find that. In fact, if you go to ChinaSource.org, I think you'll click under, Institute, and then find that webcast directly there, probably on the front page as well. Brent Fulton, thank you so much for sharing these thoughts, the narratives that we tell that we need to revision and refocus through the eyes of Christ and see what is taking place in China and how it affects our lives in many ways that we probably previously did not realize. Thank you so much for coming on Missions Pulse today.
David, it's been great to be with you. Thank you.
All right. Well, God bless.
Missions Pulse. Know God's heart, join his mission. This podcast is powered by Within Reach Global. Subscribe, watch, and listen on YouTube today. Visit missionspulse.com.